Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Before we move to the formal business of the meeting this evening, I've got two announcements to make. The first, as fellows will, I hope, be aware from the communication that came round yesterday, today is something of a historic day in the history of the Society. We've been tenants in various ways in this building for 150 years, but since Tuesday, we've been owners of a 999-year lease on the building. I felt that we ought to mark that in the ordinary meeting. Double rations of champagne. The second is to say that this evening's ordinary meeting is a joint meeting with the Society for Promotion of Roman Studies, the Society for Promotion of Hellenic Studies, who we welcome. If I might just allow the Secretary of the Roman Society to say a few words before we proceed. Okay.
Can you hear me? Good. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Hellenic and the Roman Societies to this evening's lecture. We're very happy to collaborate with the Society of Antiquaries in this historic building, and pleased that they're going to be here for at least another 99 years. And I hope that we will be collaborating with them through that coming century. I'll just say a few words about the two societies. The Hellenic Society is the senior of the two, Roman Society following in its footsteps. And we provide support for the studies of the two ancient cultures. And I wanted to stress that this support takes a number of forms, not just the serious learned journals that both produce with reviews and articles. Also on the Roman Society side, there's Britannia, looking after the archaeological work in this country. But we have a vast range of additional lectures and also, particularly in the Roman Society, of which I'm the honorary secretary, we arrange visits to sites and museum exhibitions, that sort of thing. And I feel particularly strongly about the support we give to schools and scholars. We offer money to buy textbooks for schools that are introducing, say, Latin or classical studies into their curricula. And we support trainees in museum, what do they call them? Stages of fortnight or so in museum collections. And so there's a full range of things that the two societies do. And of course, what matters is we're always looking for members. So if you want to support Hellenic and Roman studies, please consider being a member. There are some leaflets on the table there, and some rather jolly free magazines from the Hellenic Society. We don't seem to have anything quite like that in the Roman Society. We do our messaging online. So I hope you'll very much enjoy this evening's presentation, and thank you for the opportunity to address you.
Thank you so much. Minutes.
Meeting Thursday, the 24th of October 2024, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 17th of October 2024 were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society Julius Caesar's Nautical Invasions of Britain by Dr. Mark Samuel, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 31st of October, 2024, and then adjourned the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Admissions.
The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes desire to be admitted a fellow: James Dixon, William Adam, Norman Doe. James Dixon.
James, by the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. Welcome and congratulations.
William Adam.
William, by the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. Welcome.
Norman Doe.
Norman, by the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. Welcome. Congratulations. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear our lecture. Our lecturer this evening is Professor Giacomo Terrenato, who's an old friend and former colleague of mine. Nick is now S.B. Van Diemen Collegiate Professor of Roman Studies and the Director of the Kelsey Museum at the University of Michigan. He's well known for his fieldwork in Italy. He's been directing a major project at Garbi and another at San Omobono in Rome. And his broader work on early Roman conquest, formation of states in Italy is extremely well known. His prize-winning book, Early Roman Expansion from CUP in 2019, exemplifies that work. He's been working, as we say, San Omobono, and this evening he's going to be talking to us on urban borehole surveys and the origins of the Roman Forum. Nick, welcome.
All right, I hope you can hear me okay. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here and presenting our work. There are co-authors to this work, as you can see, who I would like to acknowledge. So what we're talking about today is the Roman Forum, perhaps one of the most visited archaeological sites on the planet, and yet very few of the visitors, as they walk on what is more or less the Augustan era surface today, know that they are, especially as they are in the center of the piazza, they are, so to speak, floating over meters and meters of sediment that has accumulated over the centuries, much more so than most other archaeological sites, and even in Rome itself. The Forum has one of the deepest accumulations that we find anywhere. And this has been realized, for almost 150 years now. And yet, the precise nature of what lies under the Forum floor is still up for debate. And in fact, it has been very vivaciously debated in recent decades and remains, I would say, one of the great conundrums of early Roman archaeology. So what I would like to do today is to take you through some of the new evidence and some new thoughts that we've had based on new evidence, and to see if we can make any progress in understanding the nature of what lies under the Forum and what that tells us about the early development of Rome. So we owe our first information to this man, Giacomo Boni, who was the Venetian architect, who was the director of the Forum excavations around the turn of the century, that, the one, not the last one, the last one, and who was able to dig a trench under the Augustan levels. You see the slab here, and he goes down about 5.5 meters into all these levels. And what he's expecting to find is a series of earlier floors. And this is based actually on his experience in Venice, where he had excavated under the Piazza San Marco sequence, producing what is considered the earliest medieval archaeology sequence ever recorded in Italy. And in Piazza San Marco, he had found exactly what he had expected to find, a series of piazza floors, one after the other, going down into the early Middle Ages. He did not find that in Rome at all. He, in fact, found these soil layers. Occasionally, there was gravel that perhaps could be interpreted as some sort of rudimentary floor, but really no recognizable Forum piazza, and which confused him. And in fact, he never published the excavation in full, perhaps because it didn't, meet his expectations. He even found some burials at the very bottom of it. And his partial publication, which was also repeated in the 50s by a Swedish archaeologist, led to the belief that, continued for many decades, that perhaps there had been habitation in the Forum before the creation of the first piazza. And this is because some of the levels contained burnt wattle and daub fragments that seemed to possibly belong to huts, although they were not. They were all sort of broken up and not in situ. So fast forward to the late 80s and early 90s, and an American archaeologist, Albert Ammerman, shows up, and this is his sidekick at the time, 25-year-old me, a lot of years ago, when I could still be photographed from up top without harm. Albert Ammerman proceeds to conduct hundreds of manual boreholes. You see the equipment all around the Forum area. This is the Capitoline Hill. This is where the Forum is. This is the Palatine Hill. This is the valley where the Via Sacra, this very important Roman road that went on the valley bottom between the Palatine and the Velia, ran. And these are not even all the locations. There are many, many more. And as a result of this really systematic, painstaking work, is able to understand better the profile and understands for the first time that the Forum is a very deep valley. That it was a valley, it had been understood before, but he really is able to figure out the contours and the shape of the valley and where the valley bottom is. And he comes up with a hypothesis that this is a valley that was flooded, based on the fact that Rome was very prone to flooding until a dam was built upriver about 130 years ago. But before this dam, the river was a very unruly, the Tiber was a very unruly river, and it could flood a lot of low areas, including the Forum. This is the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina in the Forum, and this is the Forum getting flooded to a level of probably around 14, 15 meters above sea level, which is, quite high. So Ammerman's interpretation, which is perfectly logical given the information that was available at that point, is that the Forum is a deep valley originally that gets flooded seasonally, and therefore the Romans cannot use it because, well, they can use it for some burials in the dry season, but they cannot use it for anything else because the floods are going to come every year. And that until the Forum is filled in, so he interprets a lot of these bottom layers as intentional fill that the Romans would have dumped to create a sort of land bridge from the Palatine Hill to the Capitoline Hill, so that which they could, this strip of land, of dry land, that they could use as their first piazza. Now, on this really interesting and creative notion, archaeologists, and early Roman historians of early Rome seized upon, because, of course, this would signal this crucial moment where the community of the Romans is coming together with this great project. Ammerman estimates about at least 10,000 cubic meters of soil needing to be dumped, which is a lot for if you don't have mechanical diggers. And so people understandably pinpoint this as the first great public project in Rome. And so the question then becomes, when does this happen? And unfortunately, the information on this was and still is very fragmentary. And in fact, you see the fragments right there on the screen. Boni, understandably for the period in which he was operating, does not collect all the pottery that he finds. It's a miracle, in fact, that he collects some pottery and keeps track, apparently quite accurately, of which fragments come from which layer, which is, cutting edge archaeology for 1901. And however, these fragments are not very easily datable. And so this becomes a ceramic problem where you have various ceramic experts. Most are hovering around a date in the mid-7th century BCE, but there are earlier dates that go into the 8th century BCE. So essentially, these few fragments of pottery become the key fossil to determine when Rome becomes Rome from a certain point of view, when the Romans finally get their act together to create their first political center. This seems to make perfect sense. And this is where the debate was when we started working at San Omobono. Now, San Omobono is on the river and is at some distance from the Forum. And when we started digging at San Omobono, we had no intention of tangling with the problem of the Forum. It was just an entirely accidental byproduct. San Omobono, which you see here from the air, is this fascinating sanctuary site that is built on very close to the riverbank, not today, but the ancient riverbank. And that is built in two major phases that we can recognize. One that is dated to the second half of the 6th century BCE, where there's a small temple. And then there is a massive leveling up of about 5 meters. And then new twin temples are built on top of that, which are then renovated many times during their life, but they remain essentially at the same level. So there are two major levels. And we have an interest in a variety of things, but that, as I said, including recovering potentially some waterlogged deposits, which we don't have in Rome. But we are not worried about the forum or the geomorphology of the area in general, except that when we get to the bottom of this trench, of the trenches that we're excavating, this is the location of San Omobono. You see the riverbank, the Tiber Island. We are in the middle of the Forum Boarium. We realize that in order to understand the temple, and you see here a portion, the new portion of the archaic podium of the temple that we had exposed, realize that we need to figure out better what is going on in terms of the geomorphology. In other words, how is the temple situated in its landscape at this time in the 6th century, BCE. And so we start doing mechanical boreholes at the bottom of our trenches with great effort. And progressively, we move on to drilling mechanical boreholes all around. Well, all around, all these red dots are locations where we have a mechanical borehole. These boreholes produce, this is the kind of machine, and they produce these cores that I admit are rather unappealing, but they actually contain a lot of information. I don't want to go into too many technical details. I could really bore you to death with the issues of granulometry and magnetic fields. But the essential point here is that it is possible, well, first of all, that the recovery, that is to say, how much soil we get from each borehole here is exceptional, thanks to new techniques that we were able to deploy. And second, that there are ways in which we can analyze this kind of material in very great detail and with new techniques. Once again, I don't want to go into all, but these boreholes that are normally used by geologists just to look at the general sort of macroscopic geology of a site or to test for certain engineering purposes, we are using them as if they were miniature digs, which has been done elsewhere, but not so commonly in central Italy before. And so the sense is that for each of these boreholes, we treat it as an archaeological trench, a miniature archaeological trench, of course. But we recover the pottery, we recover the plant material, and this plant material can be dated with radiocarbon, and there is the layers can be matched through their magnetic profiles. So there are a number of ways in which we can extract a lot more information out of this. And once again, our primary purpose here is simply to reconstruct what was the riverbank of the Tiber in the 6th century BCE when they built the temple for the first time. We have no other purpose. But in doing that, we discover a number of interesting things. Essentially, we discover that here is the cross-section, the Tiber Island, the channel of the Tiber, and then the shoulder where the Temple of San Omobono is. And these are all the boreholes. And again, these diagrams contain a lot more detail that I'm asking you to absorb. It's simply to say that what we have is two important things. One is that there are multiple fault lines that no one had seen before. And fault lines, you know what they are? They are small plaques that are shifting against one another. So in other words, it means that there are parts of Rome that are sinking while other parts are rising, right? And this, of course, on a large scale is what creates continents and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. We're talking here at a very small scale, maybe of a couple of meters, but that's enough to really change the landscape of the city, or of the valley. So for instance, we can determine that the riverbed changed its course, as is normal for many Mediterranean rivers. And most importantly, that it was originally running at a much lower level than anyone had imagined. And this actually matches other observations that were made elsewhere along the course of the river. So the Tiber right now averages the level is on average around 5 or 6 meters above sea level, was actually much closer to 1 meter above sea level. Now, this discovery, which is relevant also for morphologists and even engineering people. So suddenly the city is paying attention because this is actually relevant for the management of the city. This means that the temple of San Omobono, which you see here in its archaic phase, was actually sitting on a shoulder. It wasn't at the level of the river as originally was thought to be. And even when the Tiber would rise, as you see here in this reconstruction, it would, the flood would not touch the temple, which is very good because at this time, temples are made in non-Greek cities. They're made of essentially mud and timber. So you can imagine that they have a little stone socle, a stone podium, which you see here, but as the water rises above that level, that's it for the temple. It dissolves like a sugar lump in the water. So they need to be, and this is an expensive thing to do. This is certainly the oldest temple we know in Rome, and in itself an important achievement for the Romans. We know that it's built at considerable expense, and so they definitely wouldn't do that if they knew that this would be flooded every year. And this had always been a problem for Ammermann's explanation. He himself recognized that there was one problem, that his idea that there were floods always in Rome up to 8, 9 meters above sea level made it impossible for the temple to exist. So he thought maybe there was some sort of embankment, maybe there was, maybe the elevation of the temple is wrong. He admitted that this created a problem. Our reconstruction instead removed this problem because the river is much lower and then the flooding is much lower, then the temple is not threatened, which is exactly what we saw. The other thing that we saw, however, is that this rather wonderful situation that prevailed till for a good part of the 6th century started to deteriorate very radically in the second half of the 6th century. The faults were at work. So you see here between the end of the 7th, the early 6th, and the, this should say late 6th century, we see that there is slippage and there is new flooding and there is alluviation. So there are greater floods, and these floods are bringing a lot more soil than they did before. In other words, in simple words, the valley is filling up very quickly. And once again, thanks to our new techniques, we're able to date this rather catastrophic event much more closely than ever before. And we date it to the latter part of the 6th century, something around 530, 520 BCE. So much later than anyone thought. It is at this point that the riverbed changes its course, that the valley fills in, and then of course the flooding starts happening at a much higher level. Not surprisingly, this is around the time when the temple of San Omobono has to be abandoned, because when it was built, maybe around 560, it was high and dry, but around 520 or maybe 510, that was no longer true, and they have to abandon it and rebuild the temples, just like I was saying, 5 meters above. And actually, this 5 meter figure is very close to the amount of alluviation that we see. So the valley rises on average 5 to 6 meters, and so does the temple. So this seems to make perfect sense. If your landscape gets filled in and goes up 5 meters, your temple has to go up 5 meters as well, more or less. We were very happy because we thought, okay, so this makes perfect sense and explains the story of the temple much better than anything we had before. And we thought that, this was all that we were going to gain from this work until we tried to put it in a broader perspective, because we started to say, well, so we started to think in a larger scale. So this is San Omobono, this is the old riverbank, this is the valley that goes towards the Forum, this is the Forum Square, this is the Capitoline Hill, Palatine Hill, this is once again the valley between the Palatine and the Velia. And all of this area, there was all this Ammerman data, and there was also excavation data from the north slope of the Palatine. And so we started to say only a couple of years ago, what if we try to piece it all together? We put it all on one map and try to create a sort of master section of the whole Forum Valley. So, and the section line that I'm about to show you is this green line here. And I am sorry that is not a straight line, but it does follow the valley bottom. So if you drop a water here, it follows more or less this line to go down to the river. So it's a drainage line, in other words. And when you start drawing the section in this way, this is what you get. This is the riverbed. These are our boreholes. This is the excavation of Boni. These are Ammerman's excavation, and this is the excavation at the north slope of the Palatine. And this is the bottom of the valley as it can be reconstructed based on all of this evidence. So it is sloping up as it is supposed to, and this is where the Forum levels are. Now, when you project our known flood levels onto this landscape, you see that the floods do not originally reach the Forum. So the floods before these catastrophic events that I was talking about did not reach the Forum. This is shocking news, because if they did not reach the Forum, why would you want to fill it in? Why would you want to kill yourself dumping 10,000 cubic meters of soil in a place where there is no flooding? And so this started already to create a very curious situation for us. And here you get a sense, of course, of where the Temple of San Omobono is, once again, high and dry from the original flooding. Remember what I said, that this is the standard flooding of the Tiber Valley, probably since the Bronze Age, since the second millennium. And this all comes to an end towards the end of the 6th century BCE. So here enter the infamous Wall of Romulus, with this supposed great discovery, which I was also kind of involved in, and the one and only time I'm sure that I will be on the front page of the New York Times, although, just billed as a worker. And this is, a long and complicated story that would take us very far, and that some people in the room probably know more about than I do even. But in any case, this is a place where this strange feature was found that was dated to the 8th century BCE. And whatever the interpretation of this feature, which is almost certainly not the fortification of a city of Romulus, what we did have from this excavation was a good sense of the date of the fill of the valley. So here we are on the north slope of the Palatine. Let me backtrack for a second so that you see where we are. We are right here. So we are on the edge of the Palatine over the valley. And so this is the valley upstream from the Forum. And remember, we have information about the valley downstream from the Forum. And what this shows us is that here too, the fill of the valley, this fill, which we excavated very carefully and kept all the pottery from, actually dates to, once again, the very last decades of the 6th century BCE. So this picture is beginning to come together in that you have fill, late 6th century fill upstream from the Forum and downstream from the Forum. Incidentally, it is on this fill that the Via Sacra, the earliest paved road, probably certainly the earliest paved road that we know in Rome, and possibly the first ever to be paved, is created again at the end of the 6th century BCE. This was archaeologically dated quite closely. So you have essentially a world that has two main horizons, which this section tries to capture. The light brown is a situation before the Great Fill, and this darker brown line is a situation afterwards. And as you can see, there are, this is a simplified version, but essentially there are these two great horizons. And once again, you transition from the bottom one to the top one, in the late 6th century BCE, as a result of all this phenomena that we were talking about, the fault lines and the alluviation. So in a fairly catastrophic series of events. So this kind of creates a problem for the traditional date of the Forum, because if you have late 6th century fill upstream from the Forum and late 6th century fill downstream from the Forum, and also you have no good reason to fill in the Forum before that time. If Occam was an archaeologist, I think he would tend to agree that the easiest solution here is to conclude that the fill of the Forum too dates to the late 6th century BCE, and that these pottery pieces are what we call residues. They are older pieces of pottery that have been recycled and have kicked around in the archaeological levels, as we know they do, and they wound up in layers that are actually later than the date of the pottery themselves. We always are taught in university, but then we conveniently forget it when we're in the field very often, that these are simply, each of these pieces is a terminus post quem. It just tells you that the date of the layer is after the production of that object, not at the production of that object. And this, so triggered all sorts of other reflections. We started to see that essentially let's call it this pre-transformation. Pre-transformation architecture was at a lower level, that is to say the temple, and post-transformation architecture was all above. So for instance, the Regia and the Palatine complex and the first drain, which incidentally, so this would be the flooding before the transformation, and this would be the flooding after the transformation. And you can see that it seems to make good sense in that, as we were saying, once the flooding reaches a much higher level, so 9 meters above sea level, then the Temple of San Omobono has to be abandoned. And the Great Drain, the Great Cloaca Maxima that drains the Forum, has to be built. And the Forum, has to be filled up or be flooded. And this is also when this part here, which is not affected to flooding, and yet that is once it gets filled. Now, if you wanted to defend an early date for the Forum fill, you could argue that it was a terrace, right? That this was filled in earlier, and then later on the transformation happened. We cannot rule out this possibility at the moment, but it seems highly unlikely because before this period, you would need a major retaining wall, which is exemplified here in a book by John Hopkins. And we know that there is no technology for such a retaining wall. So this Forum terrace, even if people wanted to build it, it would be almost impossible to build before, say, 550 BCE, when the building techniques become suitable for this kind of construction. Similarly, if you have a terrace like this, you need to drain it. And for drainage, you need to do what they did, which is to create the Cloaca Maxima. Now, while for a long time it was said that nothing of the original cloaca survived, recent explorations in the tunnels have led to the discovery of original parts of the Cloaca Maxima, which you see here. And these parts, once again, they are dated to the last few decades of the 6th century BCE. So it seems very, of course, it's always possible that we're missing an earlier cloaca, but once again, we are simply unaware of any building techniques that would be suitable for this kind of construction. So essentially, we are in a situation where, where the hypothesis of the retaining wall, I think, has to be, if not discarded, really considered a very unlikely option. So this is all a very sort of long and circuitous way to say that we think at this point that the forum fill, what we call the forum fill, and we're going to get to whether this is a good definition, really is something that happened in the as I said, in the later 6th century, and that in a way you could say that is dated by the obliteration of the Temple of San Omobono, because it is only when they have to abandon the Temple of San Omobono that the same flood that that obliterates San Omobono is the same flood that requires a forum fill. And because we know, thanks to our excavation, that the Temple of San Omobono is really only abandoned around 520, as I said, it seems unlikely that any forum fill existed before this date. Now, you may think, and you'd be justified to think, oh my goodness, he's taken us round all these boreholes just to lower the date of a silly layer by 100 years or 150 years. And you would be right, except that this is for some of us, it's a really important layer as it happens. Because remember what I said right at the beginning, that historians and archaeologists had seized on these layers as a sign of the first urbanization of Rome. And in fact, there had been, since this is a major debate, and since there are people who want for Rome to have been already a functional city, however you want to define the term, which is not uncontroversial, already in the 7th century, a lot of people, some extremists, even in the 8th century, when, of course, the traditional date for the foundation of Rome by Romulus falls, and others in the early 6th century. And all of this now would be solved in the direction of a much later date. In other words, Rome would not have a forum until this late, a fairly late stage in the game. Now, of course, let me point out that we cannot rule out that there was activity on the forum floor before the fill. It is a fact, however, that we see no evidence of that. And the evidence primarily comes in the form of these gravel floors that I was talking about. This may not be a flood zone anymore, but you still need some gravel not to, sink into the mud. It is still a side valley of the Tiber. And in fact, this is precisely what we see in these layers that are up at this level. In the bottom layers, we see no evidence of that. So there is this first consideration, and then there is a second, perhaps even more momentous consideration about the nature of the fill. Because once again, Emmerman was very insistent that this had to be voluntary, that had to be intentional. You had to dump this soil. And as I always tend to tell my students who in America especially, have no earthly idea of what a cubic meter is. And so I tell them, well, there is about 14 barrowfuls to a cubic meter of soil. And they also have never used a wheelbarrow, most of them. So I say, well, just imagine, and of course they wouldn't have wheelbarrows, they would have baskets. So, imagine we're talking something in many hundreds of thousands of baskets of soil that you have to dump to create the fill that Ammerman was talking about. Now, so one important consequence of our line of reasoning is that the Forum fill is not isolated anymore, but is part of a much larger fill. And this fill, certainly in the San Omobono area, where we have been able to investigate it thanks to the boreholes in great detail, is mostly natural in origin. So it is a fill that is not intentionally dumped, but that is the river that is bringing most of it. And some of it is coming down from the sides of the hill. And landscape historians in this area had already identified through the pollen record and in other ways that there had been massive deforestation, both at the city site and also upstream from the site. So what seems to have happened is that the Romans and the other people who lived in this area messed up their own environment, something we would never do today. So they, in the process of building the city and cutting down a lot of trees and trying to open up a lot of areas for cultivation, they unwittingly released a lot of soil from the hillsides and from the valley bottoms. And all of this soil came down to Rome, and because of the fault lines that were creating what we call soil traps, the kind of holes in the valley, depressions in the valley that will trap soil and make it deposit there. And there is good evidence that this is exactly what is happening. We have a situation where for the most part, all the fill that we have down here is, once again, natural in origin. Now, you may say, so what? Well, this makes a huge difference if the Romans really had the wherewithal to do this massive public work in the 6th or even the 7th, not to mention the 8th century BCE, or if they were simply coping with a sort of natural disaster that had happened, a bit like, Venice, in that way that occasionally the lagoon does strange things and still does, and you have to live with it and try to make it work and mitigate it. And this seems, at the moment, the most likely hypothesis, because an intentional deposition of all these for the entire valley is unthinkable and, most importantly, unsupported by the core evidence. So we can tell that the most likely scenario is that alluviation, flooding, filled in the bottom part of the valley, and colluvium, that is to say sheet erosion, filled up the upper part of the valley. And these two big phenomena conspired together to change the landscape of Rome in a very radical way. What the Romans probably did is what people normally do after a catastrophe of this kind, which is to try to make the best of it by leveling, by draining, by building new surfaces, by dumping some gravel so that things are going to be a little drier. But this is much more in line, incidentally, with the regional picture. One side effect of what I have been telling you is that this actually brings Rome very much in line with its regional peers. Rome did not emerge in isolation. We're very prone to something called Roman exceptionalism, thinking that Rome is this unique place. And certainly it becomes a unique place. But in the early Iron Age, really, it was a budding city site, like there were many others in Etruria, in Latium, in Campania, not to mention all the Greek colonies. Now, when we look at this evidence, and here you have, for instance, a cross sample of various cities. This is Carriage, Vetri. This is Satricum in Latium. This is Tusculum, also in Latium. This is Pompeii. Of course, this is a much later period, but we do have now data about the archaic forum of Pompeii. In all of these cases that stretch the entire length of the urbanized tract of Western Central Italy, these piazzas are all happening in the later 6th century BCE. So while it is shocking for us to think that Rome did not have a forum until such a late date, in fact, that is the case for the majority of the other cities. So it should not surprise us at all. It just is something that evidently these cities only get around to doing quite late in the game. Now, this has all sorts of implications, which I do not pretend or hope to explore in the few minutes that I've got left. But I just want to emphasize that this ends up having a major historical repercussion, because if it makes a big difference if you have already a city government that is able to mobilize those kinds of resources at an early stage, or if the forum is, from a certain point of view, an afterthought. This is something that the Dutch excavators at Satricum, for instance, had already noticed, that first had come the cult place, the temple in Satricum, and that only at a fairly advanced stage in the life of the temple, which is this structure here, a piazza had been created and formalized in front of it. And in fact, their interpretation is that that piazza was, its original function was really connected to temple functions. So of course, now later on, the forum takes on an enormous significance. It becomes this great center of power. It becomes this place where the destiny of the Mediterranean is decided. So it's very easy for us to project that role back to the very beginning of the city, especially because at least some historians have liked to think of the Romans as single-minded from the very beginning. But the archaeological evidence, on the other hand, such as we have it so far, seems to suggest a different picture, one where the Romans are not just like their peers. I should have mentioned that none of these other four require a major fill. They're all built right on the surface of the city. Now, this is thanks to the fact that most city sites in central Italy are actually better city sites than Rome itself. But in any case, they don't need a fill and they don't do one. And maybe the Romans didn't either. And all they did is they took advantage and mitigated the major change in the landscape that happened, as I said, quite a late stage in the game, close to the date that traditionally, and for sure we could never know that is a reliable date or not, but to the traditional date for the beginning of the Republic rather than that of the foundation of the city. So here is, like, I'm hoping that I've showed you how we go from these very unappealing boreholes to raising questions that I think will have hopefully some resonance and will continue to engage us in historical and archaeological debates going forward. Thank you very much.
Nick, thank you very much indeed for a very clear exposition of something that has really very broad implications for our understanding. Can I open the question by, so you've given us a very clear steer that there's an ecological change up valley that is resulting in alluviation this period. Do we have anything to correlate with that, either in terms of changes in rainfall and climate or tectonics that might explain that sort of sudden shift in the landscape?
Yes, well, I mean, so we know that Mediterranean valleys are inherently unstable valleys, unlike, for instance, Atlantic ones. The rivers that go into the Mediterranean tend to have a very irregular regime during the year and to be subject to, as we have unfortunately seen in Valencia very recently, they're subject to misbehaving in quite exceptional ways. And in some cases, all you need is one catastrophic flooding event to really change the landscape. And it's enough to create certain, for instance, sandbars within the course of the river. And another whole topic that I could have gone into is that we think that the island itself is the product of, there was no Tiber Island before this great flood. And perhaps the creation of the island itself, I mean, certainly it changes the rules of the game in terms of the regime of the river. Once again, we think that this, the spread of tiled roofs and of houses instead of huts makes a big difference, because the enormous amount of firewood that you need to fire all these tiles, which is something that had been well documented, and must lead to cutting down a lot more trees. And the pollen record shows a massive decrease in tree pollen in the course of the 6th century. Unfortunately, as is often the case with pollen record, you can't find, it's a miracle to even have a century of resolution. But we already knew that there was a major, major deforestation happening at some point in the course of the 6th century. It probably happens throughout the century, but it might have reached a critical moment beyond which you only need a major, a rainy season for these massive amounts of soil to get mobilized. A really interesting contribution that is given to us by micromorphology, that is by mounting a slice of soil onto a glass slide and grinding it and looking at it under a microscope, is that you can see in these alluvial deposits these clay formations called papulae that are, you can tell, that are come from clay slopes that have been burned, because there is an element of burnt clay in it. So not only are they cutting down a lot of trees, but they are setting fire which is another way of course, clearing land, as we all know. So they probably are doing this very enthusiastically in the course of the 6th century. As it happens is that bad luck, I think, there is also this faulting movement in the valley where the old muds of the river are shifting and sliding against one another. And this creates a perfect storm at some point which changes their landscape forever. And they, from a certain point of view, you might almost think that it would have made sense for them to go to somewhere else, because really what they found after this event or series of events is a site that had very little resemblance with the one that they had chosen originally in the 11th century or whenever. But probably their investment in it, in terms of infrastructure and especially cults, was already too big to just go over to Veii, like someone had proposed to do after the Gallic sack. And they stayed, but in order to stay, this became a completely different place.
Open it to questions or comments from members of the audience. Peter.
Thinking of it as from a historian's point of view, and wondering what there is in the very problematic literary record, of course, for the early period. One of the things that was said about Tarquin the Proud was that he inflicted a lot of forced labor on the Roman plebs by digging out the Great Drain, and assuming that the date of the expulsion of Tarquin is accurately recorded by Polybius, and it's likely enough to be more or less right, that would more or less coincide with the date you want for the rebuilding of the.
Yes, all sorts of, having myself suffered in young age of being involved with people that were very keen on wild hypotheses, I try to stay as prudent as I can. But there are all sorts of fascinating correspondences. Another one, as you know, is that Livy says that the Tiber Island was created when all the belongings of the Tarquins were dumped into the river, a notion that everyone had laughed at as completely absurd. And it is absurd in the sense that you cannot create a sandbar just by dumping stuff in the river. But in terms of the date for the emergence of the sandbar, it actually tracks, because we don't think that there was an island before these great transformations that took place towards the end of the 6th century. So, and if you want to go even further, but I want to underscore that I have very little interest in going in that direction, you might even think that if you are the king of a city that has suffered so greatly, this may be a very difficult storm to weather politically. When you think that often the function of regality is to guarantee that the gods won't do terrible things to you, and suddenly the gods are doing horrible things to you, your tenure as a king may be kind of, of course, he could have been replaced by another king. So I'm not suggesting that this triggers the origins of the Republic, also because we see, and seriously, because we see a shift to republican systems elsewhere in central Italy, so where there are no floods. So it would be ridiculous to say so. But, clearly for the local history of Rome, this must have been an absolutely memorable event.
We do have a question online.
Yes.
Asking, does the foundation of the capital line therefore line up with the formalization of the Forum in this new picture? And is there likely to have been a similar alluvial process in the Valley of the Circus Maximus?
Yes, as you know, the main temple of Rome, the Pleiadic cult of Rome on the Capitoline Hill, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, was built slowly but surely in the course of the second half of the 6th century. We now have some architectural terracottas that attest to that. Yes, while with an early Forum hypothesis, you have to imagine that there is a Forum without a cult, which incidentally is something that we do not see anywhere else in Italy, so much so that supporters of the early Forum hypothesis had to recur to certain votive deposits from the Capitoline slopes that go back to the 8th century, but they're not temples. They're just holes in the ground where people have thrown some offerings. And instead, in this reconstruction, yes, you would have something that is very similar to what happens in a lot of these places, and most notably at Satricum, where the creation of temple precedes that of the Forum. And in fact, it is a formalization of the temple, a rebuilding of the temple that seems to be accompanied by the creation of the first Forum. So yes, you have a much closer connection between the emergence of public cults and the emergence of public spaces than we were thinking before. And once again, I want to underscore how outsized the role of Rome had been, because you really, when you have like 20, 30 cities, and you don't see this in any city except Rome, and yet Rome sort of carried the day. People said, oh yes, of course there must be fora in central Italy already in the 7th century, only on the strength of Rome, because all the other sites did not have even a shred of evidence of that happening.
Are there any other questions or comments? Emily?
This might be an annoying question to answer. Is it possible with the techniques you're using and all the coring data you've captured to get any kind of granular sense of the timing and pace of all the filling?
Oh, the pace of the filling.
Yeah. Well, I guess how quickly, I mean, you talk about an event or several events and it happening over the second half.
We are still in the process of analyzing all I would say that the main source of information about the rate of accumulation, so to speak, is through micromorphology, is the procedure that I was describing before. And we are still, it is a very time-consuming and expensive process, especially for long sequences such as these ones. So we're still in the process of analyzing these. But increasingly, we had our first big micromorphology report about 8 months ago, and it seems to show a very quick rate of increase to the point where it seems even possible this could have happened all in one go, that it could have happened. I mean, the record doesn't prove it, but it is consistent with an event that is so catastrophic that where most of the fill gets deposited in the same season, so to speak. It's also possible that you have multiple events. Once again, there is a chain effect because once one flood event starts creating sandbars and other sort of dams in the river, then the next flood is going to be also catastrophic because it finds the riverbed that is now completely different from the one that had existed for centuries before. But yeah, that's a great question.
Any further questions or comments? If not, thank you so much for a fantastic lecture. Can we reflect our thanks again with this?
Thank you very much.
I give notice that the next meeting will be our out of London meeting in York on Thursday, the 7th of November, when we will hear a paper, Star Car Life After the Ice, by Professor Nicola Milner, Fellow. Meeting stands adjourned. There are some drinks outside. Please join us.